The German tank commander raised his field glasses and allowed himself a thin smile. Across the desert floor, shimmering in the heat haze of North Africa, a lone British tank sat exposed on the ridge. It was a Crusader, and to the veteran eyes of the Panzer crews who had torn through Poland and France, it looked almost comical. Thin armor plates riveted together like a child's metal toy, a turret that seemed too large for its chassis. The entire machine appeared fragile, temporary, something assembled in haste by a nation that had run out of time and steel. The Germans had a nickname for these British cruiser tanks, whispered between crews during maintenance and shared over bitter coffee in the evening. They called them cardboard boxes on tracks. It was March of 1942, and in the brutal mathematics of armored warfare, the Crusader had already earned a reputation as a death trap. Its armor could barely stop a heavy machine gun round. Its mechanical reliability was so poor that entire squadrons would break down before reaching the battlefield. British crews climbed into these machines knowing the odds, knowing the statistics, knowing that German 88mm guns could punch through their protection like tissue paper from over a mile away. And yet on this particular morning, in a stretch of Libyan desert that would never appear on any map with importance, one Crusader crew was about to rewrite every assumption the German army had made about British armor. The commander of that Crusader was a 24-year-old lieutenant whose hands had stopped shaking about 6 months into his deployment. He had learned to ignore the cramped interior that smelled of cordite and sweat and hot metal. He had learned to read the landscape through his periscope, to understand where death would come from, and how to position his machine to delay its arrival by precious seconds. Most importantly, he had learned that survival in the Western Desert had nothing to do with the thickness of your armor, and everything to do with the speed of your decisions. His crew had been together for 8 months, which in the savage attrition of North African tank warfare made them practically veterans. The gunner could identify a German tank by silhouette at 2,000 yards. The driver knew exactly how fast he could push the Crusader's Christie suspension over broken ground without throwing a track. The loader had developed a rhythm that could put 5 rounds downrange in under a minute when the gun was hot and every second counted. They had survived Tobruk, survived the retreat back into Egypt, survived the grinding counteroffensives that chewed up tank crews and spat out empty hulls across hundreds of miles of nothing. And they had survived because they understood something fundamental that training manuals never taught. The worst tank with the best crew would outlast the best tank with the worst crew every single time. The sun was still low when the first reports came through on the radio. German armor moving north along the coast road, estimated strength unknown, possibly a full company. The British forces in this sector were scattered, still recovering from the battering they had taken during Rommel's winter offensive. There were no concentrated armored formations nearby, no artillery support that could arrive in time, no air cover that could be counted on with Luftwaffe fighters prowling the morning sky. There was just this single Crusader troop, 3 tanks total, positioned along a series of low ridges that overlooked a natural choke point with a ground-funneled enemy movement toward a dried riverbed. The lieutenant understood immediately that this was not a battle they were expected to win. This was a delaying action, the kind of expendable sacrifice that bought time for stronger units to reposition further back. High command would write it up as a necessary tactical withdrawal. The crews themselves simply called it getting used up. The lieutenant's orders were clear: observe and report enemy movement, engage only if necessary to slow the advance, withdraw before becoming decisively engaged. It was the kind of order that sounded reasonable in a headquarters tent, but meant absolutely nothing when German tanks appeared on the horizon with their guns traversing toward your position. Decisive engagement was not something you chose. It was something that happened to you, suddenly and without negotiation, and by the time you realized you were decisively engaged, you were usually already burning. But the lieutenant had no intention of withdrawing early. He had seen too many crews pull back at the first sign of contact, congratulating themselves on survival while the enemy rolled forward unopposed. He had also seen too many crews hold position, too long, stubborn and brave and dead. The trick was finding the exact moment between those two failures, and that moment never announced itself ahead of time. The German column appeared at 0730 hours, right on schedule according to the reconnaissance reports. Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, the workhorses of the Afrika Corps, moving in a staggered line formation that spoke of experience and confidence. The lieutenant counted 9 tanks in the first wave, with more certainly following further back. They were advancing at a steady pace, not rushing, not particularly cautious either. Why would they be cautious? They had fought British cruiser tanks for over a year now. They knew the Crusader's effective range, knew its armor values, knew that in a straight fight, a single Panzer IV could engage 3 Crusaders simultaneously and expect to win. The German tank commanders would have briefed their crews during the morning meal. They would have checked their ammunition loads, made sure the loaders had plenty of armor-piercing rounds ready. They would have reminded the drivers to watch for mine markers and soft sand. But they would not have been afraid. Fear is what you feel when facing something unknown, something that might surprise you. And the Crusader was not an unknown quantity. The lieutenant watched them come. He made no move to engage, no radio transmission that might give away his position. His Crusader sat hull down behind a gentle rise, only the turret exposed, painted in desert camouflage that blended into the broken rocks and scrub. The other 2 Crusaders in his troop were positioned 100 yards to either side, creating a shallow triangle of overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook defensive positioning, the kind of thing any competent commander would set up, which meant the Germans would be expecting it. The key was making them expect it in the wrong place. The lieutenant had positioned his troop not along the most obvious ridge, but along the second ridge, 60 yards further back. When the Germans spotted what they thought was the main defensive position on the first ridge, they would advance to engage it, and in doing so, they would expose their flanks to the real positions behind them. It was a simple trick, one that would work exactly once before the Germans adjusted, but once might be enough. The lead German tank reached the dried riverbed and began climbing the far bank. The commander would be scanning the ridgeline ahead, looking for the telltale dust cloud or gun barrel that would reveal enemy position. He would be feeling confident because he was moving forward, and nothing was shooting at him, which meant either the British had already withdrawn or they were incompetent. Either way, the outcome was predetermined. His gunner would be tracking potential threat positions through the main sight, ready to fire the moment a target presented itself. The loader would have a round already chambered, probably armor-piercing, because that was doctrine when engaging enemy armor. Even weak enemy. The driver would be focused on the ground ahead, watching for rocks or soft patches that might bog down the 30-ton machine. None of them would be watching their left flank, because there was nothing in that direction except empty desert and a low ridgeline that offered no cover and no tactical advantage, which was exactly where the lieutenant had positioned him. The German column was spreading out now as they came up from the riverbed, spacing themselves properly to minimize the damage from a lucky artillery strike. They were doing everything correctly according to their training and experience. They were advancing on what they believed was a known enemy with a known capability in a known tactical situation. The German army in 1942 was perhaps the most professional fighting force on Earth, and these particular crews had been fighting in North Africa long enough to understand desert warfare at an instinctive level. They maintained proper interval. They kept their guns oriented toward threat sectors. They moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that only comes from months of working together under fire, and that professional competence was about to kill them. The lieutenant waited. His gunner had already ranged the lead tank, a Panzer IV with additional armor plates welded to the turret front. 1,200 yards, well within the Crusader's effective range if you knew how to use the gun properly. The problem with the Crusader's 2-pounder main gun was not accuracy, it was penetration. At long range, the solid-shot projectile simply did not have enough kinetic energy to punch through the frontal armor of a Panzer IV. British doctrine therefore emphasized close-range engagements where the 2-pounder could be effective. But close range meant giving up your one advantage, which was spotting the enemy first. The lieutenant had spent months thinking about this problem, had argued about it with other tank commanders during long nights when sleep would not come, and he had reached a conclusion that went against everything the manual said. The 2-pounder could not penetrate a Panzer's frontal armor at long range. This was true. But it could absolutely penetrate side armor. And if you could force the enemy to expose his side armor while he was looking somewhere else, then suddenly the weak British gun became perfectly adequate. The lead Panzer IV reached the crest of the first ridge, exactly where the lieutenant expected. The German commander was probably congratulating himself right now, having crossed the most vulnerable point without taking fire. His tank rotated slightly as the gunner swept the forward sector, searching for targets that were not there. The turret was traversing right, which meant the crew's attention was focused right, which meant they were not looking left. The lieutenant spoke one word into his throat microphone, a single syllable that his crew had been waiting for. His gunner fired without hesitation, and the Crusader's 2-pounder gun barked with a sharp crack that echoed off the rocks. The solid-shot round crossed 1,200 yards of desert air in less than 2 seconds. It struck the Panzer IV exactly where the lieutenant had aimed, on the side armor just below the turret ring, in that narrow space where the thinner side plates met the thicker frontal armor. The German tank staggered as if punched by an invisible fist. What happened inside that Panzer in the seconds following the impact was something the lieutenant would never witness but could imagine perfectly because he had seen the aftermath enough times. The solid-shot round punched through the side armor and immediately began ricocheting around the crew compartment at speeds that turned metal fragments into shrapnel. The kinetic energy that failed to penetrate frontal armor was more than sufficient to catastrophically penetrate side armor, and once inside the confined space of a tank, that energy had nowhere to go except through soft human bodies and critical mechanical systems. The German commander probably had just enough time to register the impact, to understand that his tank had been hit from an unexpected angle before fire and pressure and fragmentation turned the interior into a killing box. The Panzer IV lurched to a stop, smoke already beginning to pour from the engine deck. The rest of the German column saw one of their lead tanks suddenly stop and begin burning, and they reacted exactly as their training dictated. They accelerated forward, looking for the threat, guns traversing toward the first ridge where they expected to find British position. The lieutenant's other 2 Crusaders opened fire simultaneously. 2 more German tanks staggered under the impact of solid-shot rounds, hitting side armor. The Germans were now in the worst possible tactical situation for an armored force. They were taking fire from an unknown position. They had casualties, and their immediate instinct was to close with the enemy and bring their superior frontal armor to bear. But you cannot bring your frontal armor to bear against an enemy whose position you cannot identify, and every second they spent searching for the source of fire was another second they were exposed. One of the Panzer IIIs tried to reverse, its commander understanding faster than his compatriots that they were in a kill zone. The lieutenant's gunner put a round through its engine deck at 1,300 yards, and the Panzer III shuddered to a halt with flames licking from the rear compartment. 4 German tanks were now immobilized or burning, and the surviving tank commanders were beginning to understand that they had made a fundamental miscalculation. The German response was professional and immediate. The remaining tanks scattered, breaking formation to present multiple targets and deny the British gunners easy shots. 2 Panzers laid smoke, filling the riverbed with billowing white clouds that would break up lines of sight and allow the Germans to reposition. Another Panzer began firing high-explosive rounds at the suspected British position, walking the fire across the ridge in an attempt to force the Crusaders to displace, or at least suppress their shooting. It was exactly the correct response, and if the British had been positioned where the Germans expected, it would have worked. But the lieutenant had already ordered his troop to shift positions, all 3 Crusaders reversing down the back slope of their ridge and moving laterally before taking up new firing positions 200 yards from their original location. By the time the German suppressive fire began to find its range, the British tanks were already gone. The smoke in the riverbed was thick now, effectively cutting the battlefield in half. The lieutenant understood he had perhaps 2 minutes before the German armor either withdrew or coordinated a proper assault on his actual positions. 2 minutes was not much time, but it was enough. He repositioned his Crusader to cover the most likely avenue of approach, a shallow gully that offered the Germans a covered route toward his left flank. His gunner was already scanning through the periscope, looking for movement in the smoke. The loader had 4 rounds racked and ready, fingers already reaching for the next projectile. The driver kept the engine at high idle, ready to move instantly if the lieutenant gave the order. Every man in that cramped metal box understood they were on borrowed time, that their initial success was a tactical surprise that would not repeat, that the next few minutes would determine whether they drove away from this engagement or burned. A Panzer IV emerged from the smokescreen, moving fast and low through the gully exactly as the lieutenant had anticipated. The German commander had realized his flank was exposed and was trying to reposition to a more defensible angle, which meant he was moving parallel to the British positions rather than directly toward them. It was a smart move, the kind of tactical adjustment that marked an experienced crew. It was also exactly the wrong move against an enemy who had already anticipated it. The lieutenant's gunner fired the moment he had a clear shot, and the round took the Panzer IV in the rear quarter, where the armor was thinnest to save weight. The German tank slewed sideways as the driver lost control, then erupted in a fireball as the penetrating round found the ammunition storage. 5 German tanks down. The smoke was beginning to clear, blown by the morning wind that always picked up around this time. The lieutenant could see the remaining German tanks attempting to form a defensive position around their burning comrades, crews probably debating whether to continue the advance or withdraw and call for artillery support. The smart play would be to withdraw. They had taken unacceptable casualties against an enemy whose numbers and positions they still had not clearly identified. There was no shame in pulling back to regroup, not in the professional German army where tactical flexibility was valued over suicidal courage. But the lieutenant also understood something about the psychology of armored combat. Tank commanders did not like withdrawing when they had not seen the enemy clearly. It felt like running away, and men who commanded 30-ton war machines generally did not think of themselves as the type who ran away. There was a better-than-even chance that the German company commander would order one more push, one more attempt to close the distance and bring the fight to knife range, where German armor and gunnery were known to be superior. That is exactly what happened. The remaining 4 German tanks advanced together, a coordinated rush designed to cross the danger zone quickly and get into close quarters, where the Crusaders would have to fight frontally or retreat. It was brave and aggressive and tactically sound, and if the British had been a standard Crusader troop with a standard commander, it would have worked. The Germans would have closed to 500 yards. Their superior frontal armor would have made them effectively immune to return fire, and they would have methodically destroyed each British position with precise gunnery. But the lieutenant had no intention of fighting them frontally. He ordered all 3 Crusaders to reverse again, moving back into the sides, maintaining the oblique angles that made their weak 2-pounder guns effective. The Germans accelerated forward, seeing the British movement and interpreting it as the beginning of a retreat. They pushed harder, crossing open ground at nearly 30 kilometers per hour, confident that they could catch the British tanks before they could escape. The lieutenant waited until the Germans were committed, until they were moving too fast to easily change direction, until their focus was entirely on the British tanks they could see in front of them. Then he ordered his driver to stop and traverse hard left. The Crusader spun in place, turret rotating to bring the gun to bear on the flank of the nearest Panzer III, which was now passing his position at a distance of less than 800 yards. The gunner barely had to aim. He fired, and the solid-shot round went through the Panzer III's side armor like it was not there. The German tank kept moving for several seconds, its momentum carrying it forward, before it ground to a halt with smoke pouring from every hatch. 6 down. The other 2 British Crusaders were firing now as well, and the German advance disintegrated into confusion. The remaining 3 Panzers tried to stop, tried to rotate to face their attackers, tried to do anything except continue forward into what they now recognized as a carefully prepared ambush. 1 Panzer Mark III took a round through the turret side, killing the gunner and wounding the commander. The tank slewed to a stop, its surviving crew bailing out into the desert and running for cover. 7 down. Another Panzer IV managed to get its gun around and fired a return shot that missed the nearest Crusader by less than 10 feet, the high-explosive shell kicking up a geyser of sand and rocks. The British gunner fired back, missed, loaded another round, fired again, and hit the Panzer IV's tracks, immobilizing. The German crew continued firing from their stationary position, and now the engagement had devolved into the kind of close-range slugging match where German armor superiority should have been decisive. The lieutenant understood they were out of time. The immobilized Panzer IV was continuing to fire, and even with poor mobility, its gun was more than capable of destroying a Crusader at this range. The remaining German tanks were repositioning, their confusion clearing as they began to understand the British positions. Within minutes, possibly seconds, the Germans would coordinate their fire and begin systematically destroying each Crusader. The element of surprise was exhausted. The tactical advantage was gone. This was the moment when you withdrew before you got used up. But the lieutenant also understood that withdrawing now meant those last 2 German tanks be free to continue their advance, free to roll over whatever weak defensive position existed further back, free to contribute to the next battle where British forces might not have any tactical advantage at all. And so he made the decision that separated him from officers who survived the war and those who received posthumous medals. So, he ordered his Crusader forward, directly toward the immobilized Panzer IV. His driver hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to understand what was being asked, then pushed the throttle forward. The Crusader surged ahead, racing across open ground at maximum speed while the Panzer IV's gun traversed to track the movement. The German gunner fired and missed, the high-explosive shell passing behind the Crusader's stern as it jinked left. The lieutenant's own gunner could not fire while they were moving this fast over rough ground, the gun barrel bouncing wildly as the suspension struggled to absorb the impact. They were closing the distance now, 500 yards, 400 yards, well within the range where the Panzer IV's gun could not miss. The German loader would be slamming another round home. The gunner would be refining his aim. The commander would be making minute adjustments to ensure the next shot connected. 300 yards. The lieutenant ordered the driver to brake hard and turn, swinging the Crusader's flank toward the German tank, deliberately exposing his weakest armor. It was the kind of move that looked suicidal unless you understood what he was actually doing. By presenting his flank, he allowed his gunner to fire while the tank was still moving, negating the Panzer's accuracy advantage. The Crusader's gun barked, the 2-pounder round crossing the shortened distance in less than a second. It struck the Panzer IV's gun mantlet, the thickest armor on the entire tank, and bounced off harmlessly into the sky. The German gunner fired a split second later, and his shot was perfect, aimed exactly where the Crusader's hull would have been if it had continued its straight-line approach. But the British tank had already turned, and the German shell passed through empty air. The lieutenant's loader was already chambering another round, hands moving with mechanical efficiency, despite the noise and fear and understanding that they were seconds away from dying. The gunner adjusted his aim, compensating for the Crusader's movement, compensating for the range, compensating for the morning wind that could push a small projectile off course. He fired again. This time the round struck low, catching the Panzer IV's lower glacis plate, where the frontal armor sloped to meet the hull floor. The solid-shot projectile punched through and kept going, passing through the driver's compartment and into the fighting compartment beyond, and the German tank seemed to lift slightly as internal ammunition cooked off. 8 down. The 9th and final German tank had seen enough. Its commander ordered a withdrawal, reversing rapidly while firing smoke grenades to cover his retreat. The lieutenant considered pursuing, but decided against it. His Crusader's ammunition was running low. His crew was exhausted, and most importantly, they had achieved something far more valuable than destroying one more tank. They had created doubt. The German crews who would hear about this engagement, who would see the burned-out wrecks, who would listen to the surviving commanders describe what happened, would no longer be quite so confident about engaging British Crusaders. They would hesitate, just for a moment, just long enough to wonder if the next Crusader they encountered might also have a crew that knew exactly what they were doing. The lieutenant ordered his troop to withdraw to a pre-planned rally 0.3 miles back. All 3 Crusaders were still mobile, though his own tank was making an ominous grinding noise from the transmission that suggested they had pushed the machinery past its design limits. His gunner was shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off, the kind of full-body tremor that came after sustained combat. The loader was already counting remaining ammunition, making notes for the resupply report they would file when they reached friendly line. When the driver was focused on getting them back to safety before the Luftwaffe showed up, or German artillery began dropping shells on their last known position. Behind them, 8 German tanks burned in the morning sun. The immobilized Panzer III's crew was attempting to put out the fires, knowing the tank would need to be recovered and repaired, knowing this engagement would go into the after-action reports that would eventually reach North African headquarters. Tunes. The surviving German company commander was on his radio, calling for support and reporting contact with unexpectedly effective enemy arm. His report would be precise and professional, because that was the standard in the Wehrmacht, but underneath the military language was a question that he could not quite articulate. How had the British, with their inferior tanks and their reputation for mechanical failures and their seemingly endless capacity for defeat, managed to destroy most of his company before he could meaningfully engage them? The answer, though the German commander would never fully understand it, was that the lieutenant and his crew had stopped fighting the war the manuals described and started fighting the war that actually existed. They had accepted that their tank was inferior and built a tactical approach around that inferiority. They had understood that armor thickness mattered less than armor angles, that gun penetration mattered less than target selection, that mechanical reliability mattered less than crew coordination. Most importantly, they had recognized that the Germans' greatest advantage was their confidence in their equipment and training, and therefore the way to defeat them was to attack that confidence by doing things that should not have been possible. This engagement would never become famous. It would not be mentioned in the major histories of the North African campaign. The lieutenant would not receive a medal, because medals were given for actions that other officers could understand and explain, and what he had done was so outside standard doctrine that most officers would have court-martialed him for it if the results had been different. His crew would never talk about it much, because men who survived combat by breaking rules generally understood that drawing attention to those broken rules was a poor survival strategy. The three crusaders would continue fighting through the rest of the North African campaign, would eventually break down due to mechanical failures that had nothing to do with enemy action, would be replaced by better tanks with better armor and better guns. That made the entire engagement meaningless in retrospect. But for other British tank crews who heard the story third-hand and distorted, for junior commanders who were trying to figure out how to keep their men alive in inferior equipment, for that one young corporal who would become a captain, and then a major, and then a colonel, who would train an entire generation of British armor officers in the art of fighting smarter rather than harder, this engagement mattered enormously. It demonstrated that the cardboard tanks everyone laughed at could win if the crew understood how to use them. It proved that tactical creativity could overcome material inferiority. It showed that the Germans were not invincible, that their professional competence could be turned against them, that confidence was a vulnerability if you knew how to exploit it. The lieutenant never learned any of this, of course. He died 4 months later when his Crusader took a direct hit from a German 88mm gun. During the First Battle of Alamein, the shell penetrated the frontal armor, which even his tactical brilliance could not prevent at close range, and he and his entire crew were killed instantly. The official report listed it as another unavoidable loss due to inferior British armor, which was true in the narrowest tactical sense, and completely false in every sense that mattered. His death was not unavoidable. It was the inevitable result of asking men to fight in tanks that could not protect them, of sending crews into battle with equipment that was obsolete before it left the factory, of maintaining a doctrine that emphasized aggressive advance when the machinery could barely make it to the battlefield. But before he died, before his war ended in fire and noise and the sudden absence of everything, the lieutenant and his crew had won an engagement they should have lost. They had destroyed 8 German tanks and damaged a 9th with 3 Crusaders that everyone agreed were death traps. They had done it through skill and courage and a willingness to question every assumption they had been taught. They had proven that wars were not won by the side with the best equipment, but by the side that best understood how to use the equipment they had. And in doing so, they had created a legacy that outlived them, a story that spread through the British armored forces, a lesson that would be studied and refined, and eventually incorporated into doctrine that would help win not just battles but the war itself. The desert swallowed their story, the way it swallowed everything, covering it with sand and time and the endless succession of battles that made any individual engagement seem trivial. The burned-out German tanks were eventually recovered and repaired or scrapped, depending on the damage. The British Crusaders continued their service until they were replaced by American Shermans and British Cromwells. The tactical ground where the engagement occurred was fought over a dozen more times before the war moved on to other continents and other theaters. Within a year, it was impossible to tell that anything significant had ever happened there at all. But significance is not measured in monuments or memorials or marks on the landscape. It is measured in changed minds, in lessons learned in young officers who heard the story and understood that they did not have to accept defeat just because their equipment was inferior. The cardboard Crusader and its unknown crew had taught them that much, at least, before the desert and the war consumed them entirely.